Welcome to this Young Minds training course, An Introduction to Adolescent Mental Health. So Young Minds is the UK's leading mental health charity fighting for children and young people's mental health. And what we really want to do is to make sure that any young person who needs support with their mental health gets it no matter what. And that's what we're all about. And this course today is designed to equip you with some of the information and knowledge that you need to help ensure that you are more able to support those young people and help connect them to what they need if they need it. So this course has been designed for anyone working with children and young people who wants to have a better understanding of mental health and build on their existing skills to support the emotional well-being of children and young people. During this course, we will be developing a shared understanding of mental health and thinking about what is normal adolescent behaviour and when we might be concerned that their behaviour is a sign of something more concerning. We will also explore some of the factors that may put a young person at risk of developing mental health illness and think about some of the ways that we can support their emotional health and well-being. During this course, it might be helpful to think about a particular young person you are working with or have concerns about as we go through the course. So mental health is a phrase that's becoming far more common in our vocabulary, and it's important that we develop a shared understanding of the term. So first off, I would like to just start by asking you to take a moment to reflect on the words and phrases that spring to your mind when you hear the term mental health. So this slide here shows some of the responses that we get to this question when we ask it in the training room. You can see on there, we've got things such as depression, anxiety, happy, sad, good and bad, positive or negative, not enough support, needing help, self-harm. So there's a whole range of things that the word mental health brings to mind. And whilst conversations around mental health are becoming ever more commonplace, there still remains a lot of stigma around those with mental health, with many young people reporting that they are treated as being weak or attention seeking if they reach out for help. This picture might be gradually changing for the better, but we need to be aware that for many young people, there is a lot of worry about seeking help if they are struggling. And what we as adults need to do is to try to balance these discussions around mental health to become much more neutral. So it's not even about being more positive, but about being more neutral about it being just something that everybody has. We all have mental health and we all need to work on it in the same way that we talk about our physical health. We don't always talk about that in positive or negative terms. It's just the things that we do. So it's about making those discussions more neutral and more open and less judgmental. And in terms of how we define we defined mental health at Young Minds, we take a very asset-focused approach to it. So we like to kind of think about Young Minds, about mental health being about the strength and capacity of our minds to grow and develop, to be able to overcome difficulties and challenges, and to be able to make the most of our abilities and opportunities. So as I've already said, we all have mental health. And it's not about being happy all the time, but about being able to manage life's ups and downs. And good mental health allows us to make the most of the opportunities that we have. So when thinking about this in relation to the adolescents we support, it's helpful to think about how we can help them in terms of building their strengths and capacities. So how can we help them with the skills that they need, the techniques that they need, the knowledge that they need to help them overcome challenges and difficulties that they're going to encounter? And how can we make sure that whilst not all of our young people will have the same opportunities or abilities, that we can help them make the most of the opportunities that they have? And we've also got this post-it on the slide, which I think is a really helpful thing to hold on to. And it says that having a mental illness does not define who you are. And this is really important because for a young person who's experiencing mental illness, it's not the only thing that is going on for that young person. They are more than just that. And we need to kind of hold on to this idea that there is more to that young person than their mental health. So when we're trying to understand more about children and young people's mental health, it's really helpful to have a framework to work within. So what does good mental health look like? And you might want to think about a young person that you're holding in mind at this point and how they fit on this framework. How do they measure up? What's going on for them? So all of these attributes are important in terms of our sense of mental health, and having these will help us to ensure that we have a good sense of mental health. So first off, we're thinking about having an ability to enter into and sustain mutually satisfying personal relationships. So there's a couple of key things we need to think about here. So it's not only the ability to enter into relationships, but the ability to sustain those relationships. And that's a key difference here, is that how do we sustain those relationships over time? It's also about those relationships being mutually satisfying. So there being that right balance of give and take, those relationships working and being positive. And adolescents who are experiencing mental health problems might struggle with that, with both aspects of that. So firstly, that sustaining of relationships, because it's hard to reflect, reach out and trust if we are in distress. And in terms of the mutually satisfying element of it, again, those relationships tend to be one-sided if somebody's struggling with their mental health. So they can be very, very dependent or very, very dominant in that relationship and struggle to find that balance, that natural back and forth that occurs in a healthy relationship. So next, we're looking at this idea of a continuing progression of psychological development. And psychological development includes a variety of developmental markers around cognitive development, emotional development, social development, intellectual development. And what we tend to see in a young person who's got a healthy state of mental health is that there's a progression as they grow, and these things continue to develop and they continue to learn in response to what's going on around them. So perhaps if we take emotional development as an example, if you reflect on that kind of idea of a toddler and their sort of tantrums that they might have. So they really struggle, don't they, when they're little with big feelings, and it comes out very physically. And they, you get the stamping of the feet and the shouting and all of those things. But what we would expect to see as that child grows is that they start to be able to manage those big feelings in a much more positive and calm way, in a mature way. Okay, so that's what we're looking for in our children and young people, is that ability and that development of those abilities to regulate those parts of their emotions. And again, when somebody's struggling with their mental health, this is an area that often gets flagged up. So they find it very difficult to manage and express those big feelings in appropriate ways. And we see them then developing coping mechanisms that are perhaps less helpful than they could otherwise be. So an indicator that they're struggling would be those looking at the way they cope with emotions. And next, you've got this idea about an ability to play and learn. So if we take those two one at a time. So first of all, that ability to play. So play is one of our core emotional needs. We use play to process our experiences and make sense of the world around us. And when we talk about play, what we're talking about here is activities that are undertaken for the sheer enjoyment of doing it. And one of the things we get from play, from things that we do for the sheer enjoyment of doing them, is that relaxation and just that fun, that experience of fun. And adolescents who are not given the opportunity to be playful and spontaneous tend to be anxious and hypervigilant. So let's spend a second reflecting on what play looks like in adolescence, because it does change from that very young, the way young children play. They start to play in different ways, don't they? So what we tend to see with adolescents is they like to spend time in social groups, talking to others, communicating with others, laughing, joking, or simply hanging around. As also it appears to us adults. But actually what we need to do is recognise the value of that time and the way that they play, the joking and the back and forth and the importance that that is. And like I said, as adults, we don't often value play or those activities that are less structured, but actually that time is really important in terms of managing stress, processing, learning, all of those things. So we need to encourage and support that, really. And when we're talking about learning, in this sense, we're referring to learning as being much more than just the formal education a young person might receive. This encompasses the way that we learn and respond to events and new information. So when our mental health is good, we're able to process experiences and be reflective. We're open to new ideas, we're open to challenge. But when we're struggling, these things can be affected, and that impacts on our ability to grow and learn. As we've said, that's an important part of our mental health, this thing about growing and learning and responding to what's going on. Then we've got this idea about the ability to tell right from wrong. And the importance here is that if we don't know the rules of the world, we can't effectively operate within these. And that can cause lots of challenges in terms of our relationships, in terms of playing and learning, in terms of all these other aspects of our mental health. So it's really important that we help our children and young people to develop this ability to tell right from wrong. And what we see during the adolescence is this period where we're really developing our own sense of morality, and we're starting to notice the things that matter to us. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, actually, young people and adolescents in particular have been really vocal about the things that matter to them, whether it has been through Black Lives Matter, or whether it has been the school climate strikes. Young people are at that stage very open to taking on board these things and really learning that, and that's what they're learning at this time, what matters to them. And then finally, we've got this idea of a clear sense of identity and self-worth. So we have to have a good idea of who we are and how we fit into the world. And we have to believe that we matter if we want to have a positive sense of mental health. And during adolescence, this sense of identity can often dip, because we're going through that period of rapid growth and exploration and trying to find our place in the world as we move from childhood to adulthood. So it can dip, but it is important that we are able to find that sense of ourselves. So for young people, it's really important that they find the people that sense of belonging. They find their group. They find a place where they feel safe and they feel happy. And that's really important for our young people at this time. So I'm now going to start to think about the things that might influence a young person's mental health. And what we've got on the screen here is something called the Biopsychosocial Model. And this was first used by an American psychiatrist, George Engel, in 1977, to really start to think more holistically about mental health. And it's also actually used in understanding physical conditions such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all of those sorts of things. And it provides us with, I guess, an expansion on the nature-nurture debate, and it also considers the events, and it looks holistically, therefore, at what makes us who we are and what brings us to the point that we are at in our lives. And this model can help us to understand why some people may go on to develop mental health difficulties and others don't, despite having similar experiences. But it can also help to take the judgment out of some of our own difficulties because we can see where they come from. And whilst you may not have the ability to impact on some of these factors, as trusted adults, what we are able to do is to influence some of these things going forward. So we can really think about the nurture that child receives when they're in our care, and we can think about how we can influence future events. So whilst we can't change the things that have happened in the past, we can have an impact on what goes on for that child when they're in our care and the future events that may happen to them. So when you reflect on the child that you're holding in mind, you might want to think about what you know, what you need to know about them, because you won't always know all of this information. But what it's helpful to do is to hold on to this idea that every young person you work with is much more than you see or you will likely know, and that all of these things that go into making them who they are will be influencing them. And one of the things that we've started to explore at YoungMinds is also the idea that it's not necessarily the things that we are born with that impact on our mental health or increase the risk of us developing a mental health problem, but it's the way that those things are received by other people. So, for example, if we have a young person who's on the autistic spectrum, it's not the autism itself that leads to an increased risk of them developing mental health difficulties. It's the way that that autism is received by other people around them and the way that it affects the nurture they receive and the events that happen to them that shapes where they end up. So it's not the autism itself or the disability or any other thing that that child was born with, but it's a way that that impacts on the nurture they receive and the events that happen to them that's really important. So that's quite a good thing to hold on to as well. So what we think about at YoungMinds quite often is this idea of risk and protective factors. And it's almost like this seesaw, isn't it? We're trying to tip the seesaw, tip the balance in favor of a positive outcome. Okay, and what we've got here is this idea of the fulcrum in the middle is representative of what that child is born with. What do they bring to the world? So for some children, that fulcrum is going to be positioned so that it's much more likely that they're going to have a positive outcome. And therefore, we don't necessarily need to put in place as many protective factors. For other children, it's going to be the other way around. So that fulcrum, what they're born with, is going to be positioned in a place where they are born with lots of risk factors. And by risk factors, what we mean are things that increase the likelihood of somebody experiencing mental health challenges. Okay, so if they're born with lots more risk factors, we need to put more protective factors in place to balance out that risk. So when we're thinking about risk factors, it could include things such as poverty, family disharmony, disability, issues around engagement at school, and protective factors could include things like a positive school environment, a warm and supportive home environment, or access to consistent positive adult relationships. So as adults working with young people, if we can understand the risk factors that are at play for a young person, we can start to then think about what protective factors matter. Importantly, we need to hold on to a couple of ideas. So risk in and of itself is not causal. Okay, so just because somebody is born with some risk factors doesn't mean they will necessarily go on to develop a mental health difficulty. But risk is cumulative. So the more risk factors in a young person's life, the more likely it is that they will develop a mental health difficulty. We also don't always need to know what all the risk factors are to be able to build in protective factors. And often what we do within schools is work on the basis that if we can build an environment that automatically offers those protective factors, then those young people who have lots of risk factors, but we don't know about them, will benefit from that protective environment. So it's thinking about how we can create an environment that offers those protective factors, so offers that positive school environment, free from prejudice, free from discrimination, that offers those access to positive adult relationships, that those are available to all young people, regardless of what we know about them, because we don't always know the full story about what is going on with the young people that come into our school environment. So key things we need to hold on to then. So risk is not causal, risk is cumulative. So the more risk factors, the higher the likelihood of developing a mental health problem. So let's hold on to those ideas as we move forward. And what we're going to do now is start to explore some more specific examples around adolescence and how adolescence interacts with mental health. So why is it that adolescence is a particularly vulnerable time for young people in terms of their mental health? So the first idea that we're going to think about is about adolescence being a transitional process. So we know that during adolescence, there's lots of developmental tasks that young people have to negotiate to make that successful transition to adulthood. So What we did was we asked our young activists to identify what transitions they faced during adolescence. And on the slide here, you can see the flip chart that showed some of their responses. And what we also need to do then is consider the implications of all of this when we're working with teenagers. And the first thing that always strikes me whenever I look at this is the sheer complexity of what's going on for our teenagers. It really makes you realize how much they're going through. And maybe holding on to that idea can help us be more empathetic to their situation. And that's really important. There is a lot going on for our teenagers. They've got a lot of things to cope with. However, it's also really important that we don't ignore the signs of potential mental health distress and attribute it to hormones or being a teenager. It can be very difficult to tell the difference, and what we're going to do later on is explore that in a bit more detail. But whilst we need to hold on to the idea that all of this is going on for our adolescents, we also need to not use this as a way of dismissing their distress. So let's have a think a little bit more in detail about what is going on for our teenagers. So firstly, we've got this idea that turmoil and confusion are necessary aspects of development during adolescence. So there really is this period of trying to find who we are, seeking out our identity, working things out. And it is a very confusing and difficult time. There's lots of things going on for them. But that's kind of okay that happens. It's a necessary part of adolescence. Adolescence is a transitional process, not a stage, with overlapping relationships and issues. And I think that's really important as well. It's not about a linear journey that somebody will go on through that development. So during adolescence, we move forward and backwards. So sometimes we might seem like we're being very mature, and other times we might seem like we're being very immature. And you may even see adolescents that are having tantrums that are reminiscent of those toddler days. And there are lots of overlapping issues that are going on. And it's that kind of continuing struggle for independence while still being immature and not necessarily able to manage everything on their own. So it's a really difficult time. There's this idea here that physiological changes tend to precede the psychological ones. So young people who are going through adolescence can actually look more mature than they really are. And that can impact quite significantly on the way that adults treat them and adults respond to them. And so we need to kind of acknowledge that sometimes, you may be confronted with some young people who are very physically developed and they look like adults, but they are not adults underneath. So we need to hold on to the fact that they are still developing and they're still young underneath. So even if you're presented with a 16-year-old who looks very much older than they actually are, they are still developing. And we need to kind of be aware of that and the way that impacts on those children, young people as well. So, we hear from girls particularly perhaps who are being exposed to much more sexualized behavior because of the way that they look, but they're not psychologically ready for that. Again, boys that are being exposed to much more grown-up behaviors, but they aren't psychologically ready for that. So it can be quite difficult for them. So parts of the brain associated with emotional reactions mature earlier than parts associated with this executive functions, and we'll think about this a little bit more. But essentially, that emotion, we're very beholden to our emotions during adolescence, and those executive functions, so that logical stuff, the reasoning, isn't yet developed. And there are uneven developments of aspects of the self. So, like I've said, you can be quite mature in some aspects and quite immature in others. So it's not kind of a straightforward process, or it's really, really easy to see what stage somebody is at and treat them evenly in all parts of their lives. And one of the other things to be aware of when we're working with adolescents is how this period of life affects our sleep. So during this time, adolescents actually need more sleep than the average 10-year-old or adult because they're going through a huge period of growth. We also see physical changes. So melatonin is produced much later in the evening in adolescents than in younger children. So it doesn't start to increase until around 11 p.m. So for a lot of adolescents, they don't feel sleepy until much, much later in the evening than a younger child or an adult. So if they don't get to sleep until midnight, and they have to be up at 7 a.m. for school, they're missing out on around 2 hours of sleep a night. And that can have quite a significant impact. In terms of our mental health, then, we know that a lack of sleep can lead to all these different things. So it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to lowered immunity, it can lead to us being clumsy and having accidents, poor judgment, poor memory, slower reactions, and increased cortisol levels. So it can lead to lots of negative things. So when we're working with adolescents, it is worth holding on to this idea that actually poor sleep could be behind a lot of the emotional issues that they're struggling. Again, it's not about blaming that or automatically seeing that as being the solution. But if we can recognize that sleep could be playing a major factor in how they're feeling, and we can help them with that, then we're likely to be able to have a positive impact. And of course, it's really, really difficult to have an impact on that. And there are other things apart from the physical changes that will be affecting the sleep of our adolescents. So social media use, the use of caffeinated drinks, and high levels of general screen time, lack of exercise, all have the potential to impact on the sleep of adolescents. And the challenge for us is, well, how do we tackle this issue? And it's a really difficult issue to tackle. Firstly, we can obviously start off with information and education for young people about how much sleep they need, how it's likely to impact on their mental health. And the other thing that can work quite successfully is working with peer groups to reduce social media and screen time and improve sleep hygiene over a set period of time to help them actually experience the difference. So one thing that young people tell us that, well, I can't not respond to my social media posts because then I'm going to be missing out and I'm not going to be part of that. So they find it quite hard to do that. So if we can set an agreement as a whole group around this idea of, okay, we are all going to switch our social media off at 9 p.m. whatever it happens to be. Over a period of a couple of weeks, we're going to reduce our social media. We're going to try and do some other things to improve our sleep hygiene. Then they might actually get to know and feel and experience the difference in getting more sleep. So that's one opportunity, but it is worth just holding on to that idea about sleep. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, there's lots going on in the adolescent brain, which can impact on their mental health. So adolescence is a time of huge brain growth and remodeling. And our knowledge of brain development is improving all the time. And research into plasticity of the brain gives us real hope that during this time, actually, things can be really positively focused. We can really do a lot of good work with young people who've perhaps not had the best start in life. This is an opportunity to really shape their future development and give them the things that they need. So we know that brain development continues up until at least the age of 20, if not longer. During this time, then there's significant remodeling of the brain. So particularly what we're thinking about here is the frontal lobes and the connections and the limbic system. Okay, so what's happening is got two things. We've got myelination. So during this time, what happens is the connections that we use the most are basically strengthened. So they work quicker and they're stronger. So during this time, what we want to be doing is helping that brain to make positive connections. There is also this idea of synaptic pruning. Okay, so those unused pathways, unused neural pathways will begin to shrink and decay. So it's a kind of use it or lose it principle during adolescence. The things that we use the most will become stronger, and the things that we don't use, the links that we don't use in their brain, will actually decay and shrink away. So there's a lot going on in our brains. Okay. we've also got this mismatch between emotional and cognitive regulatory modes in adolescence. Okay, so kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. So what tends to happen is the emotional parts of the brain develop first. So what teenagers are experiencing is a heightened sense of emotions. And at the same time, what's happening with the cognitive, so the logical thinking parts of our brain, is they haven't developed yet. And they even slow down to some extent. So it becomes much harder for teenagers to assess risk and make logical decisions. But what they're also noticing is they're very attuned to emotional experiences. So they really experience very, very strong emotions and heightened emotions from those things. At the same time, they're not able to make the best decisions. So that's why we sometimes see in teenagers then that mismatch between what's going on and those just really behaviors that just don't make any sense. And how this then tends to come out is through these different things. So these are the ways that young people cope with all of this stuff that's going on. So first of all, you've got this idea of acting out. And it's a way of communicating thoughts and feelings that are too painful to put into words. So what we need to do is look beyond the behavior to understand what the young person needs to communicate. So we're replacing our thoughts by action. Then you get this idea of projection. So what we're thinking about here is that appreciating that all humans can both be good and bad, sometimes at the same time, is a relatively sophisticated position to hold emotionally, even if we can understand it intellectually. And young people can struggle to hold themselves as both good and bad, competent and struggling. And so as a defense mechanism, these parts of the young person can be projected into the trusted adults around them, meaning some will be denigrated and others will be held up as ideal. And this can be a really confusing experience, both to the young person and the adult. But we need to view that as communication of how fragmented the young person feels in themselves and recognize that this is what's going on. We also see this testing and rejection of adults, especially parents, and it's all about really testing the strength of those relationships. How much do you care? And then we get this idea around being and functioning as part of a group. So humans are really social animals, and there is a strong evolutionary desire and a need to be part of the pack and conform. However, as individuals, we also crave autonomy. So again, it's really confusing to work through this and find a balance that's both right for that individual and helps them to be part of that group. So it's kind of about, how do I be both part of the group at the same time as being an individual person? And we get then this idea of seeing themselves and others in polarized ways. So, that very black and white approach to things. And you may have seen this in some young people, or you may not. We've got this idea of somatization, and that's where we express and experience emotional distress through very real physical symptoms. This doesn't mean that the young person is making it up. Even if they're aware that they are experiencing their feelings in this way, the physical symptom is often very real and very painful. So for teenagers, often you might see tummy aches and headaches, body aches, all of these things, and they are very real to that young person. So it's important to acknowledge that. And then we also see this period of experimentation, and that's really all about finding that identity and finding out who we are. So trying to find our tribe, find our place in the world that's going on. So all of these things and these behaviors that we see as being typically teenager behaviors are all linked to the development that's going on and the stage of life. So what we're going to think about now then is we've talked about what mental health is, we've talked about all the things that are going on for our teenagers. And I suppose what we need to now look at is, well, how do we know when a young person is just experiencing the normal ups and downs of being a teenager? And how do we know when things have gone too far and they're experiencing difficulties with their mental health? And all young people will experience distress at times. It's part of growing up, it's part of life. So, for example, stress at exam time, sadness when a relationship comes to an end. Those are normal experiences. And it's quite important when we're working with young people to help them recognize that these feelings come and go, that things will get better, that it's part of life and it isn't anything to be concerned about. Because sometimes what we've noticed with young people recently is that the increased rhetoric around mental health makes people worry when they experience any distressing emotions that they've got a mental health problem. So we have to work with our young people to help them acknowledge that those experiences of distress are perfectly normal, and they will pass. Even if they're uncomfortable, they'll pass. But some young people obviously do become stuck and experience that more ongoing distress, and that affects their ability to enjoy themselves and to take part. And when that happens, they may benefit from additional support or interaction or intervention from the adults around them. So what we need to think about then, what is it that lets us know they're doing okay? So maybe think about the young person that you've been holding in mind. What makes you worried about them? And what might you hear from the young person themselves? So what we're going to look at on this next slide is this idea of how do we distinguish between normal adolescent behaviour and what might indicate that a young person is struggling or in distress. And you might, again, want to think about this in terms of the young people that you work with. Do any of these stand out to you or apply to them? So it's normal for adolescents to struggle through authority. It's relatively common that they're going to act out at times. They're going to experience emotional stress. They're going to be going through lots of relationship issues, exploring their sexuality. They're going to be experimenting with different things. And as you can see, if we move across the table, what we're starting to see then in those teenagers that we maybe need to step up and work out and offer a little bit of extra support to, that real loss of confidence, aggressive behavior or really kind of not managing, sexual behavior that is outside what we would expect, so very promiscuous, and that really risk-taking behavior are the things that might start to worry us. And then on the end there, you've got kind of the next step along this cycle. So where there's that bullying going on, where there's self-harm going on, where there's persistent law breaking, real concerns around abuse or sexual behavior, significant depression and anxiety going on. So there's kind of that process that we go through in terms of noticing what's going on. And some of the things that I would suggest that you also look out for is if a young person is experiencing distress, think about how long it's been going on for, how much it's affecting different aspects of their life, and whether it keeps reoccurring. Okay, so those are the things we can look for as well in terms of those challenges that a young person might be having. And we also reached out and asked our activists what they said you might notice. So this is really nice to hold on to as well. So they said that you might notice I don't react to stuff and I seem emotionless. So sometimes when we're struggling, actually, or we're overwhelmed, we start to just not react to stuff. We can't cope with anymore. So we just kind of seem quite numb. Perhaps they can't keep eye contact. Again, think about this in what's normal for that young person, because different people have different levels of comfort, obviously, around eye contact. But looking at a change in that. Seeming bored all the time, not knowing what to do, or seeming very tired all the time. Again, could be normal adolescence, but potentially a flag for us. Eating a lot more or a lot less. Again, thinking about the length of time these things go on for is important, because as teenagers go through growth spurts, they may well increase the amount of food that they're eating. So thinking about how is that impacting on them. Probably going to argue with you and become really irritable when they're struggling. Stop talking to their friends would also be something you might notice. Just fiddling all the time, finding it hard. Not caring or respecting authority. And I think the really interesting one that we've got there at the bottom there is, I say I'm fine. And what young people tell us is that you may need to ask more than once whether they are okay. Keep reaching out to them, because it's very easy just to say I'm fine, and it's sometimes easier to do that than it is to tackle what's going on. So things to look out for from our activists. And then, of course, we need to think about, well, what can we do? Because as school staff, you're not therapists, and we wouldn't expect you to be therapists. But there are things that you can do to really help these young people, and to put in place some of these protective factors. And one of the biggest protective factors we can put in place is the relationship that we have with the young people. The more relationships, the more positive relationships, the better. But it's been shown that even one supportive relationship can be enough to help improve the outcomes of young people who've experienced adversity or challenge. So if you can kind of build that relationship, and then you can use that relationship to build on their strengths and to help extend their support network. And as a result of that, what they develop is more resilience. And that's going to help them to deal with the challenges of this time of life. So one thing to think about then is, well, what makes a trusted adult? So by trusted adult, we mean those adults that young people feel comfortable reaching out to and will come to and ask for support. So just take a second to reflect on the things that you might have seen in adults that young people seem to appreciate and seem to like. So one of the things that people tell us on training is about empathy. So empathy, not sympathy. So somebody who can recognize that a young person is struggling and who can validate those feelings. A good listener, someone who doesn't need to fix. I think this is really important. Someone who doesn't make assumptions but can just hear the young person out. As adults, we often feel that it's our responsibility to have a solution, to have some way of fixing the problem, solving the problem, making them feel better. But actually, some young people, all they need is somebody to just hear what they're going through. And that's all they need right now. Somebody who's kind, so people who genuinely care and are interested in the well-being of the young person. And young people are very, very good at noticing when we're not being genuine. So don't try to fake it, because it doesn't work. They're really good at picking up on that. Understanding, so somebody who really takes the time to come alongside the young person and see it from their perspective. Somebody who is approachable, so who's open and friendly and invites conversation. Consistency, so adults who provide a reliable response, so the young person knows that when they come to you, they've got an idea what response they're going to get, and that is quite consistent. Somebody who's helpful, so although it's important not necessarily to try and have fixes for everything, somebody who's got a little bit of knowledge and ideas that can be worked into the conversation and can be available when the young person is ready for them, is really good. So, resources we can point them in the direction of, somebody who's going to help them perhaps make a phone call or help them to take some action is also useful. Adults who don't judge. It's, as human beings, we're all naturally judgmental. We make assessments and we make judgments all the time. But it's about being that person, being aware of any kind of prejudices or judgments that you are making, but also just communicating to the young person that whatever they tell you, that's okay. You're not going to be shocked or horrified about what they tell you. You're just going to listen and understand. And finally, a sense of humor. So young people also appreciate somebody that they can have a laugh with, who can make them smile, who can bring that lightness to that relationship, even when things are difficult. And what are young people? Activists say that young people want from a trusted adult, up on the screen now. So allowing the space to talk to you, and listen to what they say. So don't jump to conclusions or make assumptions. Keep checking in on us. Remind us that we aren't forgotten, even if we don't want to engage. And that kind of comes back to that, what we were saying earlier about when a young person says that they're fine, just keep going. If you feel that that young person isn't in a good place, keep checking in on them. Remind them that you are available. Remind them that they can come to you, because when they're ready, they need to know that you're there for them. So check in how they feel about any actions that you're going to take. So asking the young person what they would like to happen and not forcing them into something they're not ready for. Really, really important that we bring the young person and we collaborate with them. If we want to have a successful intervention, we need to make sure it's the right thing for that young person. They're ready for it. If you're going to signpost a young person to a service, they might need that support to call the service. So that comes back to that idea of being helpful, isn't it? It's not just giving them the thing to do, but just reaching out and asking what extra help they might need to be able to do that. Following up on things you think may have been a sign of distress. Sometimes we worry that by talking about these things, we're going to put ideas into people's heads or we're going to make things worse. But actually, for a young person to hear from an adult, well, I've noticed that you seem a little bit quieter than usual. Is everything okay? Is really validating and really adds that sense of self-worth. To be noticed is really important. So if you think a young person might be struggling, reach out and follow up on it. Ask them what is going on. And keep viewing them as a whole person and have conversations about normal things as well. That's also really important and goes right back to that post-it at the beginning. Having a mental illness does not define who you are. The young person will have other things going on and they want to talk about those as well. So in summary, then, we need to hold on to these kind of key ideas, I suppose. Adolescence is a time of growth and learning. It's often seen as a difficult and challenging time, but it can actually be a really rewarding and positive experience to help those young people on that journey and to see them grow and reach adulthood in a positive place. Young people are the experts in their own lives, so listen to them. Just hold back from making those assumptions and that need to fix, to hear from their perspective. Hang in there. It can be a difficult journey. If a young person is experiencing distress over a significant period of time, it can be really, really hard, and it can be hard on us. But hang on in there, because that consistency and that reliability is key. And finally, look after yourselves, because otherwise you won't be able to hang in there on that journey. So take the time to look after yourselves and have your own needs met so that you're in the best place possible to come alongside those young people and be there on their journey. And if you'd like to find out any more about YoungMinds, you can visit our website. There's lots of free resources available and lots of information about how you can support us and get involved. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been useful.